G'day and welcome back to CounterCulture, where we offer up the best cuts of opinion and analysis for Spectator Australia subscribers, IPA members, and friends of freedom everywhere. Today, the story about how we expose the dangerously left-wing proposed national curriculum. Mark Latham joins us to talk about his proposal to get radical gender theory out of schools once and for all. I chat to James Bolt about why he thinks we shouldn't fund the Olympics, and I tell you why we should have shut them down altogether. And when will our politicians get that nobody wants this Indigenous so-called voice to Parliament? I catch up with Tony Letford to discuss what we're not talking about when it comes to Indigenous disadvantage. And as always, Rowan Dean shares his thoughts on Victoria's ongoing hotel quarantine saga. And Sarah Dudley talks us through her Hollywood-inspired front cover. Let's have some fun.
It was research and analysis by the Institute of Public Affairs that first identified that critical race theory and identity politics were forming the foundations of our national curriculum.
Oh yes, you can bet that somewhere deep in the bowels of the office of the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, there's a big dartboard with an IPA logo on it. You know, we at the Spectator Australia and the IPA have been warning about woke insanity in education for years. Spectator Australia subscribers would have read my colleague Dr. Bella de Brera's excellent piece on white privilege lessons in New South Wales schools starting as early as kindergarten. Bella wrote quite rightly about a month ago that this blatant politicisation is equivalent to child abuse and is the corruption of the innocent. Students should not be infected with destabilising critical race theory and lunatic notions of white privilege. Very well said, Bella. Now, in a normal week, it's just the Spectator Australia and the Institute of Public Affairs tackling issues like this, and sadly no one else, because you know, you can't possibly object to 4-year-olds being taught that white people are evil because that means you're a racist. Go figure. But in the immortal words of that great icon of toxic masculinity, Popeye, Australian parents can't stand no more. This week, thanks to IPA research, the horrifying details of Australia's new proposed national curriculum exploded into the newsstands. And they are horrifying details. Australia's Christian heritage, out. The wonders of ancient Greece, out. The First Fleet, out. Fundamental legal rights like freedom of speech, assembly, association and movement, out.
How dare you!
That's right, it's the crazy woke education clearance sale. Everything must go. So what's in? Well, what do you think? The whole Invasion Day narrative for one thing, with students now learning about, and I quote, the occupation and colonisation of Australia by the British under the now overturned doctrine of terra nullius, experienced by First Nations Australians as an invasion that denied them their occupation of and connection to country/place. Now, before Twitter gets upset at me, let me just say that there's nothing wrong with learning Indigenous history. In fact, I think it's important. There's nothing wrong with learning that there are parts of Australian history that we can't be proud of, that our colonial days were complicated. But this is not about education, but indoctrination. The goal is to create not informed citizens, but angry activists. Don't believe me? Well, the new civics curriculum includes lessons on direct action as a means of participating in Australian democracy. Direct action, that's what we need more of in this country. I mean, really, why don't we just save time and get teachers to glue the kids onto the street themselves? And then, of course, we get to gender, which gets just 15 mentions in the physical education curriculum alone. PE, of all things. We've moved on from the days when sadistic PE teachers tormented students physically. Now we want them to do it psychologically as well. With the draft national curriculum saying that it is crucial to acknowledge and affirm diversity in relation to sexuality and gender in health and physical education. Of course it is. Well, fear not, friends, because New South Wales MP, One Nation leader and Spectator Australia regular Mark Latham is on a mission to get this pseudo-scientific gender garbage out of our schools. And in his must-read piece in this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia, he explains why his private member's bill is necessary and how education bureaucrats and teachers' unions are ignoring the New South Wales government's existing ban on programs like Safe Schools and even deliberately flouting the wishes of parents. Let's hear from him now. Mark Latham, how are you?
Good, thanks, Gideon. Really good to be with you.
Great to have you back. Now, I want to talk about your gender fluidity bill that you're about to introduce in the New South Wales Upper House. Why Is it necessary to introduce a bill like this? And what are the provisions in it? What problem is it trying to solve?
Well, it's broader than gender fluidity. It's about parental rights. But we've got a problem in New South Wales that Safe Schools program is banned. Gender fluidity is said to be not part of the school curriculum. But there's a whole bunch of examples of schools that are teaching gender fluidity. The Teachers Federation in New South Wales put out a so-called professional development course and instruction to say, look, here's 7 or 8 subject areas where you can work in gender fluidity. They said if you find out anything about the sexuality or gender of your students, don't tell the parents because it'll be dangerous at home. I mean, what a ridiculous, disrespectful comment about the people who've got the great bulk of parenting responsibilities, loving and nurturing their children. And, just to give you one example of how fanatical these people are, the Teachers Federation recommendation was for schools to take a day off regular class and go to the Sydney Aquarium to study, not marine biology, but what's supposed to be 2 gay penguins hatching an egg.
Oh, you're joking.
Now,
that thing.
No, I know it's funny, but it's also sad that this is the priority of the trade union for teachers in New South Wales. And then you go to Wear It Purple Day last year, where activists inside the Education Department distributed dozens of gender fluidity guides, including Safe Schools, which is supposed to be banned, to 70,000 New South Wales government teachers with all the horrendous stuff there about penis tucking and breast binding and all the gender fluidity instruction. So there's a real problem.
The New South Wales government has tried to prevent this getting into the education system. As you said yourself, Safe Schools is banned. How brazen are these education bureaucrats and these teachers' unions and all sorts of other players in the system who just feel like they can circumvent or ignore the directions of the democratically elected government?
Well, they're very brazen. And it's not just in government schools. Let's also note that some of the woke non-government colleges are going down this path. It's a huge worry. So, but inside the government system, they're very brazen. And one of the reasons is, take the example of the activists inside the Department of Education who distributed the gender fluidity guides, including Safe Schools last year. Now, clearly, they've broken government policy. Anyone with any control and authority would march them straight out the door. They were just reprimanded, counselled, told not to do it again. And this just goes on and on and on inside the New South Wales system. There was a school, a classroom teacher and a principal at Letford who had posters up. They'd taught Black Lives Matter. They had posters up about pigs out of the country, referring disrespectfully to the New South Wales Police Force. These are 11-year-olds.
Now, a lot of parents say, okay, fine, I'll send my child to a private school, maybe a religious school, where the values are closer in line with those that I subscribe to, my deepest core values. But if you send your child to a religious school, the outcome might not be that different. And that's something you sort of touched on in your piece. Tell us about that.
Well, the last line of defence here are the very Christian schools and Islamic schools who don't have any space for gender fluidity teaching and the woke agenda, and a diminishing number of Catholic and Anglican colleges and schools. The Parramatta Diocese of the Catholic schools made a submission in favour of the teaching of gender fluidity against my bill. And the bishop there put out a statement, a pastoral letter, basically saying, well, look, we have to face the fact that the teachers have got the biggest responsibility here in guiding children, guiding students. Now, the reality is parents don't get 6 weeks off at the end of the year. They don't get 12 weeks of holiday in the year. And in a full year, students only spend 13% of their waking time at school. The rest of it, obviously, family, and 99% of parents are loving, supporting, nurturing, want the best for their children. And to sideline them in a Catholic system, why would anyone pay their money?
So why are religious orders going woke? Is it a matter of appeasement, or do they actually now bizarrely believe in some of this stuff?
Well, a combination. I think one thing about religion is that it does lend itself to virtue signalling, that if the lefties are out there, the woke agenda is we need to be sensitive to certain feelings, we need to be compassionate for so-called minority groups, we need to be inclusive. All the language of the left can be adopted by clerics as part of their work, but it's virtue signalling, and in its final format, it deviates from the teachings of the Bible. And, my view is that if you're reading gender fluidity books to 3 and 4-year-olds, and that's completely age inappropriate, kids have got no sense of sexuality and little understanding effectively of their gender, this is pushing upon them something that's a child abuse. And the teachings of Jesus Christ, the timeless teachings, are to protect the vulnerable. So, preserving the innocence and the fun and the freedoms of children is very important now, because we wonder where all the mental health problems come from. So many children have lost their innocence and their sense of fun, either from stuff they get on social media or stuff they're getting in schools. Schools are now pushing upon little kids adult themes that adults find difficult to handle in this divisive political environment. So, the time when children around the country had an innocence has been lost, and inevitably this is leading to so-called anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems. And out of that, there's clear evidence of school counsellors. If a kid presents and says, I've got worries, I've got anxiety, I'm not coping well with the world, the counsellor will say, well, have you thought that you were born into the wrong body? That gender fluidity is your answer. So this is a self-fulfilling disaster.
What gets me the most about this is that nobody voted for any of this. Nobody would vote for it. Even in the People's Republic of Victoria, if you put this to people at the ballot box, they would reject it strongly. Parents really just wanted their kids to learn how to read, how to make it in the world, the skills they need to get a job, be productive citizens. Now, why does it fall to One Nation, for example, to fight back against this stuff? Why are there no democratically elected parties other than yourself and your colleagues in One Nation and a few others in minority parties and so on? Why does it fall to you guys?
Well, some, I call them civility conservatives who don't fight. Their attitude is, maybe these are difficult issues, maybe they'll just go away. Well, they're not going away, they're getting worse. And I came into the state parliament here 2 years ago to put a focus on education, not necessarily this issue, but to try and lift the veil on what's actually happening in the classroom. And this is a big factor, a big problem, and a growing number of parents give me information. And I think this is a very important public role, because the great asset of the Teachers Federation, the woke lefties, the education authorities at Parramatta is the secrecy of the classroom. If parents don't ask their kids at the end of every day and the beginning of the new day, what have you learned in the classroom, what's coming up? Well, you don't really find out what's going on. So lifting the veil of secrecy about the classroom is critical. I've uncovered things about the Teachers Federation, about what's happening inside the Education Department, and this is valuable information to parents. Parents, as you say, Gideon, who'd be horrified by this stuff, horrified to think that this is education for 10-year-olds. And as you say, nobody voted for it, but the problem of the secrecy was nobody knew what was going on. But, we need to expose this stuff to inform parents and legislate to protect their rights.
You're right, and as you said, we shouldn't have to be having a conversation about parental rights over organs of the state, but that is increasingly what it's coming to. It is appropriating people's children. It is taking power away from families. There is so much wrong with it and so much that's monstrous about it, but not to worry. We are not civility conservatives on this show. We fight hard because we need to fight hard, and of course, so do you and your One Nation colleagues. So to you, Mark Latham, thank you for your work in this area. Great piece in the Spectator Australia this weekend. Everybody absolutely must read it, and I really do hope that this bill gets up, because we need a fight back now more than ever when it comes to this stuff.
The fight goes on. We're not going to relent on this. It's time to legislate for parents and say that they are the primary educators of their children. The nuclear family is the shining success story of our civilisation, and the leftist attacks on it are anti-civilisational, and we've got to defend parents and the nuclear family.
Absolutely. Well, all the strength to your arm, Mr. Latham, and always love it when you're on this show. Looking forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks, Gideon. Cheers.
Now, if you're liking this show, you will love Morning Double Shot, a daily edition of Spectator Australia goodness brought to you by editor Terry Barnes. Terry is up bright and early each and every morning, scanning the news and offering you your first shot of comment for the day, helping you make sense of whatever madness the morning news brings. Plus, your daily highlights of what the Spectator Australia is saying about the issues that matter. And as always, of course, make sure you like this video and hit the subscribe button down below. New people are finding this channel on YouTube each and every day, and that's because of your help in beating that big tech algorithm and helping us get the message out. And now it's time to hear from Spectator Australia Editor-in-Chief, Rowan Dean. Rowan, how are you?
Great, mate. Gideon, how are you?
I'm very well indeed. Now, a great editorial this week. You've led with the ongoing saga around Victoria's hotel quarantine fiasco. So what's your take on that?
Well, Gideon, what really disturbed me is what we're seeing as the lack of competence of governments. And I put that down to their skewed priorities. The hotel quarantine is really, for me, just a metaphor of what happens when your government, whether it's local, federal, state, has its priorities all bound up with something that ultimately isn't simply about efficiency. So, for example, as I said, the quarantine hotels is a great metaphor for the way in which we've seen right from the word go in Victoria, a government that is so focused on identity politics, on neo-Marxist historical revisionism, on climate change, on all the woke agenda, that completely understandably, those things always come first, and the efficiency of the government always, therefore, by definition, comes second. And I call it the Andrews principle. And we've seen it time and time again, going right back. If you remember, right at the beginning of the pandemic, you had the Victorian Deputy Chief Medical Officer likening the coronavirus to Captain Cook's invasion in 1770. Now, no medical person could possibly even conceive of that. So clearly someone whose focus is on identity politics, on neo-Marxist historical revisionism, was put in charge of, or deputy to, the medical response from Victoria. I mean, this is a socialist state, Sacha Baron Cohen, Peter Sellers type comedy, but it got worse and it got worse. And we saw, for example, in the hotel quarantine, the employment of guards based not on their expertise of security guards, but based on either their union affiliations or the firm's supposed identity politics credentials. Now, this is laughable. One of the firms supposedly had an Indigenous a board or an Indigenous focus that gave them X number of brownie points on the kind of Victorian identity graph. Now, this is just ludicrous to be choosing for medical purposes a firm whose main criteria is that they have members of the board who are Indigenous. Ludicrous stuff. We saw it again recently with the reports that there had been air conditioning turned off for climate reasons. And the list goes on and on and on. And what I liken this to, Gideon, is these sort of joke socialist states, or even serious socialist states, whereby the focus is never on efficiency, which leads to inefficiency, which always leads to it being covered up by the bureaucrats and the officials. And then it gets even worse. The bureaucrats and the officials have different rules for themselves for the rest of the population. And we saw this again in Victoria, where supposedly the head of the quarantine process was wandering around, ignoring himself, his own rules, and saying, oh, well, I'm going to override the protocols. And again, this is virtually out of a comedy version of the Kremlin, for example, in communist China, all the top bureaucrats get to have their holiday homes on Hunan Island, but nobody else is allowed to go there. The Kremlin, they have separate roads for themselves. No one else is allowed to drive on them. So you just see time and time again the kind of classic examples of how a focus on identity, woke politics, leads basically to the very equivalent of kind of socialist totalitarian regimes.
There was a great meme floating around this time last year, which is everybody enjoying their free trial of socialism, which is sadly the case. Now, this is a great addition. We'll be talking to Sarah Dudley a little bit later in the show about her brilliant front cover this week. But what have you got for us in this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia?
Oh, there's some great articles, Gideon. Mark Latham is on fire as always about what he calls the useful idiots in the clergy, particularly in parts of Sydney. You have clergy who are basically going against the interests of again, for woke reasons. In order to be woke, they're actually going against the interests of the church, which is pretty astonishing. Great piece by Paul Collitz, where he sadly looks at the pattern: Craig Kelly, Amanda Stoker, Kevin Andrews, George Christensen. We're seeing a lot of conservatives disappearing.
Yeah.
Nicole Flint disappearing from the Liberal Party. As he says, there's a pattern here and it ain't a good one.
Yeah, no, I love Paul's article. I'll be talking about that a little bit later on in the show when I give my Spec weekend preview. And there's a great one on Flat White, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, by Arthur Trenkov, about why we need a conservative counterculture. Now, I couldn't have put it better myself, but memo to Arthur, we got one.
This is the conservative.
Correct.
You are the conservative.
We got one. Now what? Anyway, Rowan, thank you for coming on as always. Great addition. Speak to you next week.
See you, Gideon.
And remember, if you want to read more from our outstanding stable of talent at The Spectator Australia, just head on over to spectator.com.au. And if you like what you see, you can subscribe to The Spectator Australia today to get instant access to all of our outstanding content, including the weekly Spectator Australia magazine, all the articles on our online section, Flat White, and great international authors like Douglas Murray, Brendan O'Neill, James Dellingpole, Lionel Shriver, and many, many more. Just call 1-800-809-233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. Can I be honest for a hot second? I don't really care for the Olympics. For one thing, I'm not much of a sport guy and I'm a contrarian at the best of times, so basically any major sporting event bores me to begin with. But there's something especially asinine about the Olympics, creepy even. All the torches and flames and hammed up solemnity, the high wire acts and pyrotechnics and misty-eyed talk of sport bringing the world together. It's like some horrible rip-off of Cirque du Soleil if the choreographers had just spent 2 weeks in Davos. But what really bothers me is how much it costs us, the extraordinary amount of money we spend airlifting elite athletes over to God knows where, typically to spend a few minutes actually competing, and the rest of the time, well, I suppose what happens in the Olympic Village stays in the Olympic Village. But more seriously, like every other supranational organisation, the International Olympic Committee is dangerously hypocritical. While its website is replete with the usual woke garbage about gender equality and sustainability and integrity, really integrity, they have yet to do anything about the fact that next year's Winter Olympics will be hosted by Beijing, giving Xi Jinping an extraordinarily prestigious platform to showcase his murderous, authoritarian, genocidal regime to the world. But then again, the Olympics have form on that matter. They've done it before and I suspect they'll do it again. And now, for whatever reason, we're going gaga at the thought of actually hosting another one of these monstrosities. Well, not on my watch, and not on the watch of the IPA's James Bolt, who's been doing important research into the true costs of these games. And recently in Flat White, he told us all about it. Let's hear from him now. How are you, mate?
Yeah, great to be here. Very excited to finally be on the set. This is cool.
Yeah. This is all right. Great to have you here. Now, let's start with an easy one.
Yeah.
Why do you hate the Olympics so much?
Okay, I don't hate the Olympics. So this is an article I wrote for Spectator Flat White last week on the federal government's decision to stump up half the cost if Brisbane does end up winning the right to host the 2032 Games. So I don't hate the Olympics. The Olympics are fun. I love watching athletes achieve dreams they've had their entire life. Yep. I think we're going to talk about canoe slalom, which is something very close to my heart later in the show. And the thing is, what I don't like is the public subsidization of the Olympics. Now, this is something that the cities of the world that host the Olympics find out time and time again. You also find this with the Commonwealth Games, the World Cup, other international sporting tournaments. The cities that host it pay for costs well after the games are done. It does not bring in the tourism that people think it will. And it ultimately, they won't ever admit it, but the governments do regret hosting them.
Yeah, because I'm old enough to remember the Sydney Olympics. I remember the hoopla. As a contrarian, I wasn't particularly excited for them. I didn't tune in all that much, but I do remember this idea that it would open up Australia to the world and we have this flood of tourists and it would turbocharge our economy. Now, according to your excellent article and your research on this, that didn't exactly happen, did it?
Yeah, so it wasn't my research, I've got to be upfront and admit. It was research conducted by some researchers at the Monash University. And what they found was that household consumption actually decreased as a result of the Olympics. So we don't really see that economic windfall that the Olympics was promised to bring in. And then there were no real changes to international tourism coming to Australia because people already knew about Sydney. It wasn't like people were tuning in, thinking about where do we want to holiday next, and then going like, wait, what's that giant bridge in the background? That looks pretty cool. People knew about the bridge.
Yeah.
And people know about Brisbane. People know about the Great Barrier Reef. People know about Australia. So I don't know who these new tourists are that are going to be completely wowed by what they see and decide to travel here.
I mean, look, to play devil's advocate, as I said in the introduction, I'm a little bit of an Olympic skeptic myself, to put it mildly, but isn't this a good thing to be hosting the Olympics, to be, bringing nations together from all around the world, having it in our country and so on? How can you put a price on that? Surely?
Yeah, well, if it feels good, then do it. I mean, why don't we just pay everyone $1 million all the time? That would feel good.
That sounds good.
Yeah, but like...
We are actually, it's called monetary theory, but anyway.
Yeah, well, that's a problem. So, just because it feels good, just because it's like national pride, doesn't mean that there aren't going to be costs down the line, and doesn't mean that the money can't be better used elsewhere or just returned to taxpayers. You would have thought. That can't be the bar.
See, I'm obviously a libertarian myself. I don't think we should be funding elite sports at all. I don't see the point, frankly, in sending privileged athletes overseas to pole vault or swim or do canoe slalom, which we'll get to in a minute. End of the interview, don't bury the lead. I mean, we've done actually research on this at the IPA way before I appeared on the scene, and we worked out, I think, that it cost, what was it, $2 to $5 million per gold medal won in Rio de Janeiro or London or something.
Yeah, there was some insane amount it cost per medal at the recent Commonwealth Games as well. And the thing, another way you can look at it is just go through the medal count at the end of the Olympics. The USA is always going to be up there, and they don't really fund public sport. The basketball team are basketball being my absolute favorite sport. Basketball is just made up of the professional athletes.
The Chinese pay for American basketball. That's the difference. So
yeah, America really relies on private donations and the ability of the athletes to get there themselves. They don't really have the same sort of Australian Institute of Sport that we do. Yeah,
well, now that is an idea I like. So, coming to the part that everybody is interested in, you've said that in your article that the canoe slalom is the best event, bar none, to be obsessed with for 3 days every 4 years. Now, what is the canoe slalom?
Yeah, well, this is the sport of kings. It should be the national sport of every nation in the world. Now, so what it is, it's been a while since I've seen it because the Olympics have been delayed. Yeah. So there'll be canoe slalom-ers or ists watching at home, furious with how I'm describing it, but picture a canoe at the start of a river rapids, and you've just got to make your way through the gates. And some gates you have to go back upstream to get through. And
is that right?
I don't know. It's intense. There's bodies flying everywhere. Yeah. People are in canoes, which just looks funny. But yeah, this is what makes, again, I like the Olympics. Okay, everyone's got the Olympic sport that they get really into for a couple of days and then forget about for 4 years.
For you, it's the canoe slalom. All right, so moving on to more serious topics. Now, you have also written in Spiked Online this week about the Indian travel ban. Now, my view is that it's probably the most monstrous thing done by an Australian government in my lifetime, because we are making it a criminal offence for Australians to enter their own country. What sort of response have you received from that article?
Well, it only went live at midnight their time, and I think it's about 4 a.m, so response quite limited at the moment. But certainly when I was talking to the editors, when I was pitching it, they couldn't believe that this was something a government was planning to do, especially when we have such few cases of COVID in the country and so many facilities which we could host people that do come back from India positive. You think about how many hospitals are currently free of COVID patients. And the point I make in the article, and I made it on Sky News last week, is that, the Australian passport actually says on the first page that it's there to, the government is there to service any need that the bearer holds if they're overseas. And there's no fine print, unless India has a spike. This is supposed to be something that is inalienable to Australian citizens.
Correct.
But medical advice has trumped that, just as it's trumped your ability to socialise, your ability to go to work, the ability to exercise your free speech and protest against restrictions. Medical advice just now trumps citizenship.
But it doesn't even seem to be based on medical advice. A lot of things aren't really based on medical advice or even common sense through this corona thing. I mean, there's been a series of questions to the chief medical officer and so on this week about whether that advice was given. It doesn't look to me like that was the specific recommendation. So the horrible and macabre upshot of that to me is that the government thought this would be a political winner. And looking around, I mean, people are angry about it, but not as many as there should be. What does that say about corona and our lost moral compass here?
I I think it says something more than corona. I think that's just how humanity reacts to fear. And
to respiratory illness?
Well, I just think to fear in general. Like no one wants to experience what the Indians are experiencing right now. That is an absolute disaster. But, you know, the idea that there's this zero-sum game between what we have now and what's going on in India, instead of a situation where we can have people come back, we can repatriate our own citizens and make sure that it doesn't get out into the community. I know state governments have failed on that, but that has still got to be the ideal. But if you whip the people up in enough fear as to, look, India is just around the corner, one false move, we're going to be there, there's people dying in the streets, that's when you see these outrageous numbers of people that are willing to turn their own backs on their fellow citizens in a foreign country.
I've always said this is the most horrifying thing I've seen an Australian government do since March last year. I think I've said it every month, and this is no exception. And my question is, where will it end? But in the meantime, to you, James Bolt, thank you for coming on. Great having you on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and looking forward to what you write next for the great Spectator Australia.
Fantastic.
Now, while you're here, leave a comment and let us know what you think. Be like Oliver, who wrote last week, great interview with Ian Plimer and John Ruddick. It's always good to remember where the climate lunacy started. Well, thanks, Oliver. The real climate problem, though, is where this lunacy is going. But that was a great interview, I agree. And if you missed it, there'll be a link to the extended version in the show notes down below. Just click that link and check it out. And somebody named Hannah Smith, if that is her real name, writes, people will be kicking themselves in a few weeks if they miss the opportunity to buy and invest in Bitcoin. And that comment was made on an unrelated video. Incidentally, the video of the interview with John Ruddick and Ian Plimer. And it was followed by about 30 replies telling you about how you can invest in Bitcoin. Now, I should talk about these comments because we are getting quite a few of them. I'm a big believer in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. In fact, I've been shoveling my money into them for months. But these people commenting on our videos on unrelated stuff are obviously just bots and scammers. If you do want to hedge against catastrophic economic collapse by getting on board the decentralized currency revolution, don't buy Bitcoin off scammers. That's dumb. And you're not dumb, you're watching this show. And a reminder, as always, that this is not financial advice. Tax affairs are complicated. Consult your financial advisor, blah, 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 blah. You know the drill. Now, let's hear now about what's on the front cover of this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia with our covers editor, Sarah Dudley. Sarah, how are you?
I'm very well, Gideon. Great to see you again.
Great to see you, as always, of course. Now, this is a great front cover this week. I'm so glad we're back to Spectator Australia front covers this week. Talk us through it.
Well, on the cover, we see an entire plane load of Indian COVID-19 viruses disembarking a plane on a runway in Victoria, and they're on their way to a quarantine hotel, and they're greeted by an Australian virus who says, "Welcome to Victoria, home of world best practice quarantine hotels." And the Indian viruses metaphorically rub their hands with absolute glee, Gideon, because Daniel Andrews' best practice meant that 800 Victorian Australians, lost their lives last year. And heaven knows why, but their standards that they're implementing themselves, they never reach. And they've just had to fire their program manager. And, you know, as we all know, last year, security guards actually slept with guests, which is not a very good look. They ignore their own PPE regulations. And then they switched off the aircon to, lower greenhouse gases. What an absolute joke. They switch off the aircon so people catch the virus, and then they have to go on ventilators, which chew up a lot more greenhouse gases. You know, go figure. Well, the joke is, Gideon, that, the world laughed at the movie Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, which was all about a crumbling, chaotic hotel in India where elderly guests were expected to pop their clogs at just about any second, which is very ironic because with the Victorian quarantine hotels, they're actually more dangerous and more chaotic, which would be funny, but it's terrifying that Daniel Andrews' best practice, and I wouldn't like to see his worst practice, actually makes a third world hotel look competent, which leads directly to the headline, Best Exotic Victorian Hotel. In fact, Gideon, Daniel Andrews' post-political career is actually assured, I think. Just look at these couple of clips.
Now, this is not about boasting, so this is just a fact. If it was anything other than one of the best systems, the AMA over in WA were calling it the gold standard. They're not terms I use, but that's what they said. If it was anything other than a good system, then I doubt very much that other First Ministers across the country would have agreed to copy it.
Welcome to the best exotic marigold hotel. Prepare to be amazed. There's an Indian in there.
I want to stay at the other hotel, the one that's in the brochure.
In India, we have a saying, everything will be all right in the end. So if it is not all right, it is not yet the end.
Best exotic marigold hotel. Sarah, I wouldn't trust Dan Andrews to run the airport travel lodge.
Well, I kind of see him somewhere in North Korea running a hotel maybe, or Northern China. Yeah, or even he could actually take over from Basil Fawlty in Devon, but I don't think
you stole my joke.
People in Devon.
You stole my joke. I said if Spectator Australia TV wants to expand and launch its own streaming service, we could have a remake of Fawlty Towers starring Chairman Dan and Professor Brett Sutton. I think that'd be some pretty good content, actually. A lot better than his daily press conferences back in the day. Anyway, Sarah, great front coverage this week. Great to see you as always. Catch you next week.
Brilliant. See you then.
Now let's see what else we have on offer for all of our patriotic Spectator Australia subscribers. In this weekend's magazine, David Flint gives us a searing look at Australia's external and internal enemies. Paul Collitz makes the alarming observation that the coalition's most conservative MPs seem to be leaving en masse. That's very alarming there. Over at Flat White, James McPherson, we love James McPherson, he takes a look at the CSIRO's bizarre advice that we should eat less meat and more insects. Now look, I don't mind eating insects really, I did it all over Asia, but instead of meat, sorry Ciro, I won't be listening to that science anytime soon. And last but certainly not least, Arthur Shrenkov writes an extremely important piece on why we need a conservative counterculture. Well, I couldn't have put it better myself, Arthur, but guess what? We got one. Links to all those stories will be in the show notes in the description below, or just head straight on over to spectator.com.au. And remember, once again, to stay up to date with all the information you need to make sense of this cuckoo clock of a world, sign up to Morning Double Shot, your free daily email of commentary and Spectator Australia highlights, arriving in your inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. Just head on over to spectator.com.au. Well, this program is a co-production of the Institute of Public Affairs. For 78 years, the IPA has been Australia's voice for freedom, democracy, and the Australian way of life. Our research makes the case for the freedom of speech, the power of the free market, an honest debate on climate change, and the timeless value of Western civilization. We don't receive a cent from government and are not beholden to nervous advertisers. We speak out only because of the support of the thousands of great Australians who support our research by being proud and paid up IPA members. Now, as you may know, over the past few weeks, we've had a special offer for new IPA members. A bonus signed copy of Corkscrew, the brilliant novel written by the Spectator Australia's very own Rowan Dean. And I gotta tell you, they are selling like hotcakes. We only have a few copies left, so you gotta get in quick. You can sign up now to the Institute of Public Affairs and you'll receive a copy of Rowan's hilarious novel, as well as exclusive IPA member benefits like priority access and discounts to IPA events, our quarterly magazine, the IPA Review, our weekly email roundup for freedom enthusiasts called Hey, What Did I Miss? Regular updates from Executive Director John Roscombe offering his take on the tough issues of the week. Policy updates from our gun research team giving you all the ammunition you need to own that lefty mate at your next insufferable dinner party, and some merch as well. And of course, on top of all that, you'll be supporting the IPA's work and the IPA's research, defending freedom, democracy, and the Australian way of life. Just head on over to ipa.org.au/corkscrew, sign up today, and join Australia's voice for freedom. Well, we're hearing yet again about the so-called Indigenous voice to Parliament. Now, that's the thing about left-wing ideas. No matter how stupid they are, they never die. Anthony Albanese recommitted himself to the idea in the last couple of weeks, the latest in a conga line of virtue signallers attaching themselves to the woke, inclusive notion of making civil and political rights of Australian citizens contingent on race. Well, in this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia, Tony Letford reminds us of what we should really be focusing on when it comes to the appalling state of disadvantage plaguing Indigenous Australians. Let's hear from him now. Tony, how are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm not too bad at all. Now, You've made the point that Indigenous disadvantage, despite years of bureaucratic effort, we haven't made any progress at all. In fact, we've gone backwards. So why is it that we've stalled so much in this area?
Look, some of the simplest questions have such complex answers, and this is undoubtedly one of the most complex questions that Australia faces at the moment, its relationship with its Indigenous First Nations people. And one thing we fail to do in Australia is look at the global response to the emergence of capitalist economies. So that if you look, for instance, at America, North America, the Canadian and American Indians, how their response is similar to the Australians. They also were pushed off the land. They experienced dispossession, and their cultures were actively destroyed by the invading Europeans. And their response, the consequences of that, rather than their response, the consequences of that are very similar: alcoholism, anomie, a lack of engagement with the modern economy.
This isn't happening in a vacuum. We've seen over the past few decades, reconciliation marches, the national apology, all manner of inquiries, reports, and so on. When will we stop focusing on symbolism and bureaucratic busywork and more on solutions and, frankly, the real problems that the Indigenous population of Australia has?
One of the reasons why there's a preference for these sort of symbolic gestures is because no one has a real solution. The simple fact is that no one quite knows how to fix up the mess that we have been left with by almost 2 centuries of exploitation. I mean, it wasn't until the 1950s that people began to really address the issue of Aboriginal disadvantage. And there is no denying that the dispossession and the neglect and the hardship that was inflicted on the First Nations people, was continued well into the 50s. But that was 7 decades ago. And the efforts since then to fix it have gone nowhere, not because of lack of trying, but because no one really knows quite how to fix it without resorting to methods that aren't acceptable. You cannot force people to do this or to do that anymore. You have to allow a certain degree of freedom. And the degree of freedom that is allowed in this situation is preventing any genuine progress, I think.
But why the symbolism? I mean, why are we fixating on things like, say, changing the date of Australia Day, which is typically the preserve of inner city people in inner city Melbourne and Sydney, rather than actually talking about remote communities?
Because it's an easy issue. It's an easy one. You can focus on, change the date. You can get people wandering up and down Macquarie Street chanting "Always was and always will be Aboriginal land," and gestures like that. They give audio time or television time to people who want to stay in the public gaze because they know that is the way into political power. But look at what happens when they do get political power. There's infighting. You look, for instance, at the situation in the Kimberley at the moment, where the Indigenous leaders of the land councils that have been accused of misappropriating funds or misuse of funds. What's happening is that it's a struggle for power, and one way to hold on to that power is get the publicity. Get the publicity by making protests about symbolic issues like changing the date, etc. You become a big man in the community, and all Indigenous societies have the concept of a big man, someone who holds the power, and that persists to this day in Indigenous communities. And
you've written some, really great stuff in your article about the day-to-day realities in those communities, which sadly just doesn't feature in the debate. But look, to you, Tony, thank you so much for coming on. Excellent article in this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Yep, okay, thanks very much.
Well, that's it for today's edition of CounterCulture, right here on Spectator Australia TV. All Spectator Australia content and IPA research featured today is available in the show notes down below. Click those links and have a read. Remember to sign up for regular updates with Morning Double Shot over at spectator.com.au. And remember, to access all of our content from the Spectator Australia, just call 1800 809 233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. Until next week, friends.
CounterCulture is a product of the Institute of Public Affairs and the Spectator Australia, also available wherever you get your podcasts.